This is A Different Perspective with Kevin Randle. A retired U.S. Lieutenant Colonel, Kevin Randle has been studying UFOs for nearly 50 years. Kevin has investigated some of the most famous UFO cases in the world and has been consulted for dozens of documentaries about UFOs. Considered one of the leading experts into the Roswell UFO crash of 1947, Kevin has written more than 25 books about UFOs, including the recently published Roswell in the 21st Century. Now, here is the host of A Different Perspective, Kevin Randle.
And welcome to this edition of A Different Perspective. I am Kevin Randle. I will be joined in just a moment by Stan Gordon. We are going to revisit the Kecksburg case from his perspective, which I guess would be a different perspective. Before we got into that, I wanted to mention I just happened to look on Amazon a few moments ago, and I saw that UFOs in the Deep State is at number 99 on a couple of the lists there. And I think we should work hard and try to get it up to, 9 or 10, just for fun. But I mentioned that book simply because it's become more relevant in the political atmosphere we find ourselves in today. And I look at it from a very narrow point of view, which is the relationship of the deep state to UFOs. But I think it expands more broadly when we look at all the things going on, not only in this country, but around the world. But I think it gives you an idea of how that operates and why we today are still arguing about the reality of UFOs and why the government persists in its cover-up. And I mentioned this because John Greenwald had just posted something suggesting that the Navy is classifying the reports of the UFOs, they want to call them UAPs, that made up the report that went to Congress and that sort of thing. They're classifying those reports now, and I think this is just another step in the plan to keep the UFO situation where it has been for the last 75 years, where we aren't really told anything about what's going on. We have to kind of search it out for ourselves, and then we have all these other people throwing mud at the wall because they know we cannot possibly be wrong and there's no alien visitation, ergo anything we say must be inaccurate. I just mentioned this because I thought it was interesting. I don't know why the book UFOs in the Deep State has suddenly popped up as high as it is on some of those lists. I'm delighted it's there, and I hope we can grow from that point of view. As I said, I'm going to talk to Stan Gordon, and in a bit of preliminaries here. Several weeks ago, I had on Robert Young, who is a skeptic, who believes that the Kecksburg UFO crash has been solved by more mundane objects and that sort of thing. And I thought it only fair to bring Stan on to talk about his point of view and what his research has done. Stan, of course, began his investigation almost at the time the thing fell in the Kecksburg area. I will note that Stan Gordon began his interest in the UFO subject, other than strange incidents, at the age of 10 in 1959. In the late 1960s, he acted as a telephone UFO sighting report investigations coordinator for the UFO Research Institute of Pittsburgh. Stan began in the field investigations of UFOs and other mysterious events in 1965 and is primary investigator of the December 9th, 1965 UFO crash recovery incident that occurred near Kecksburg, Pennsylvania. And I would not dispute that at all. He's got to be the number one guy. In 1969, Stan established a UFO hotline for public to report UFO sightings to him to investigate. In 1970, he founded the Westmoreland County UFO Study Group, the first 3 volunteer research groups which he would establish to investigate UFO sightings and other strange occurrences reported in Pennsylvania. And I will venture to say there's a lot of strange stuff going on in Pennsylvania, but that's not what we're here for. Since November of 1993, he continues to investigate and document strange incidents from the Keystone state, which of course is Pennsylvania, for those of you that don't know nicknames of states, as an independent researcher. He is a former Pennsylvania state director for the Mutual UFO Network, got that mutual confused with MUFON, and was the first recipient of the 1987 MUFON Meritorious Achievement of a UFO Investigator Award. I don't know why I can't say these words today. of course, I guess it's something that I've been afflicted with forever. I don't know. He has been involved with the investigation of thousands of mysterious encounters from across Pennsylvania. He has appeared on numerous local and network TV news and documentary shows. Since the late 1960s, he has been lecturing to the public on UFOs, both locally and nationally, for various groups and conferences. Some of the topics include the synopsis of the Kecksburg case, UFOs and Bigfoot incidents, mysterious creatures and encounters. And his book is Kecksburg, The Untold Story. Stan Gordon, welcome to A Different Perspective.
Hi, Kevin. It's great to be talking to you again. And by the way, that was actually a documentary film, a DVD. It's out on Kecksburg, the title you just mentioned.
Oh, I thought it was about, you didn't make it clear when you sent it to me. I thought it was a book. Okay, it's a DVD. His DVD is Kecksburg, The Untold Story. We still do DVDs in this day and age?
We're still doing them.
Okay. I think that the first thing we need to do to help our audience is give me a very brief description of what happened on July 9th, 1965.
Okay, it's December 9th, 1965. I was 16 years old, and I was tuned into KDK Radio in Pittsburgh, and this is the show that Robert had discussed with you that he had referred to, where he had a guest on, would happen to be Frank Edwards, the host of the show, so I was tuned in to listen to him, and surprisingly, that segment of the show was basically covering the breaking news story of this brilliant fireball that had been seen from the tip of Ontario, Canada, over Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. And anyhow, it's quite an interesting story. They were interviewing witnesses who had seen the fireball, and they were reading the newswire stories that were just breaking across the newswire about the incident. But Robert, when he talked to you, he had stated that the fireball occurred during the time that Frank Edwards appeared on the show. Well, that is incorrect. The radio show was an evening program. I believe it was on from 6 to 9 p.m. The fireball had occurred at 4:47 p.m. that afternoon. And as the host of this show mentioned, and he sent me a large statement, that the station had many, many reports coming in prior to the show being aired. And I think that's something that's kind of important, too, because as you were discussing it at the time with him, that Robert had indicated that that show may have influenced a lot of people about the Kecksburg case. But I think what's really important is that it was during that time period when the show was on the air when a lot of activity was taking place around Kecksburg after the object had fallen. So there were hundreds of people who were arriving in the area to see what was going on, including news reporters. There were firemen and state police who were involved in various activities, and the military was arriving in the town and in the areas where the object fell. So
well, let me ask you a question. Here, because I want to get sure I got this straight. What you're saying is that the interview with Frank Edwards took place after the fireball was seen?
That is correct. The show was an evening show. The fireball had occurred around 4:47 p.m., and actually the sighting of that object was confirmed by the control tower at the Greater Pittsburgh Airport at 4:47 p.m. That show, I believe, aired from 6 to 9 p.m. in the evening, so it did not occur during the time that Frank Edwards appeared on the show. They were getting calls from people who had seen the fireball, but then a lot of the important activity out at the scene, out around the Kecksburg area, was taking place that evening as different things were occurring.
But it's almost like it was simultaneous. I mean, I understand what you're saying, that the fireball was seen prior to the show airing, but the time frame was not all that long. And I can see where people would have been listening to the show and hear some of this other stuff would become very interested in what had been seen at Kecksburg.
Right, but again, there was so much we didn't know at that time. We didn't know at that time, and for long after so many people we tracked down and interviewed about what kind of activity was taking place around the Kecksburg area. This object did not come right over top of Kecksburg. It was on the outskirts of the small community. And but there was so many people involved. You know, a lot of those witnesses back at that time, They came from all walks of life. Some were military veterans, police officers, news reporters, and other ones were youngsters and teenagers who later grew up to hold responsible positions such as teachers and engineers. In fact, one witness who had hid down the woods that night later became a district attorney in another region of the state. So these are all credible people, had no reason to make up this story, and many of them, for various reasons, did not want to go public.
Well, I think what you're saying is this information was collected not that night, but collected during your investigation over months and years later.
That is correct, because, as I talked to people who were involved in this, the next day, the stories are out in the news that the government said that nothing had fallen from the sky and they saw a bright meteor. Well, many of those witnesses knew what they saw was not what the government was saying, so they just kept their mouth shut. They told some friends and neighbors and people close to them, but they didn't go public and talk about it. And I can tell you, there's people I know that are out there today, there's some that are still living, that still refuse to talk about what happened for whatever reason.
But I think where we're going here is that you've got I guess what I'm trying to say here is, I'm fumbling for the words, obviously, is that you haven't said anything about what happened in the woods. I mean, we've got the fireball seen by the people, we've got the news media talking about it, but what happened in the woods? Was there something found in the woods? Was it found that night? Was it carried away that night? Were there witnesses that? Are there photographs of it? That sort of thing.
And all of that is exactly what was taking place. So let me just try to tell you a little bit about some of that. I think Robert brought up that there were two different searches that night, and actually there was a lot more going on. Let me tell you about some of the things that happened during the evening. First of all, this object observed by not just two children. I think Robert had brought up that there were two children, and that they were outside playing at the time, and that they saw the object fall, and they went home and told their mother, and she looked out, and I believe she said that what she saw was a smoke train in the sky that lasted a half an hour.
Is this Mrs. Kalp?
Yes.
And her house was down right near the woods.
Well, and off the opposite side of the woods from where it fell. So what really happened was, it was actually the brother and sister, young brother and sister, riding their bikes. Only the brother saw it, she did not, and they hurried home and told their mother. The woman looked outside towards where the object had fallen and observed a vertical column of bluish-gray smoke rising up from the woods above the trees, which other people also reported, but it dissipated very quickly. She did not see a smoke train in the sky. And she did call WHJB and talk with John Murphy, who was the news director. So he took all her information down, then called the state police in Greensburg, and he headed to Kecksburg. And I interviewed that witness in person, and she drew sketches for me of what she had seen. And so that was interesting. But here's about actually what some of the searches and what happened that night. So you have numerous local people, not just children, all through the area that saw the object coming in. So in some cases, it passed very low over top of their heads. Then witnesses actually saw the object go down into the woods, and within minutes after it fell, you had some local people went down into the woods, and that's when they came across this large metallic acorn-shaped object semi-buried in the ground. So this
let me stop you there, because I have to take a break. Can't help it. Have to do that. When we come back, we'll get some more detail about exactly how this worked out and some of the, into some of the minutia about what's going on. I'm talking with Stan Gordon, of course, about the Kecksburg UFO crash retrieval story that he's been investigating almost since the time it fell. I should also point out that you can get some information about that in my book, Crash When UFOs Fall from the Sky, and Stan Gordon helped me put that together. We will be back right after this, so please stick around. I am here with Stan Gordon. We're talking about the Kecksburg UFO crash retrieval that he's investigated since it happened. The DVD is Kecksburg, The Untold Story, if you're interested in getting more detail on that. I believe you can get it at Amazon and the like. When we went away, Stan, we were talking about people finding something in the woods, a metallic object in the woods. I need to understand the time frame a little bit better. We had the event take place late in the afternoon, 4:45, 5 o'clock in the evening. When did the people arrive and find the object in the woods?
Well, the local people saw this object fall, and they went down within minutes after they see this object going down into the woods. So you've got local residents down there. One resident was Bill Bulleybush. Bill Bulleybush lived in the village of Mammoth, not far from Kecksburg. And he was out in his driveway that afternoon under the dash tuning up his CB radio when he sees this fireball coming from Norvelt and moving out towards the mountains of Laurelville. So he runs out to the road.
Let me interrupt here. Let me interrupt here. What are the directions? He sees the object moving in what direction? Was it going north to south, south to north? What were the directions that he saw it going?
Okay, so let me try to explain this. It's a little confusing, but the turns of the object that I know Robert had talked about, he talked about what Ivan Sanderson was discussing. The turns that I find very intriguing is what occurred within miles in the area and before the object fell. So this object basically is coming from the greater Pittsburgh area. So it's moving basically southeast into Westmoreland County over the city of Greensburg. But it makes a turn to the south out by Route 30 east of Greens. It makes a turn to the south, and it's seen by numerous people in these small communities. And it goes from, say, Marguerite down to Norvelt. It's seen from Mammoth, and it goes out the mountains of Laurelville. So Bill runs out to the road, and he sees this object over the mountains of Laurelville, which is about 3.5 miles away. He said it looked kind of like it hesitated, then it turned and began to track back to roughly towards the northeast, towards the outskirts of Kecksburg, not right over the town, and you have people all along that path that see it going down and going back, and then it turns down again and falls down into the woods. And those people who saw the object drop from the sky said it did not come down at a high rate of speed. It came down almost like it was making a controlled landing, but nobody reported parachutes at the site or on the ground. And so within minutes after the locals see it fall, they go down into the woods. They come across this large metallic acorn-shaped object semi-buried in the ground. It's about 10 to 12 feet in length, approximately 8 to 10 feet in diameter. It's one solid piece of metal, kind of an off-gold bronze color. And on the raised-up back part of like you'd have on an acorn, some witnesses said, and one of them I'm sure we'll talk about, was Jim Romansky, who was a volunteer fireman at that time, and he was standing only a few feet away from it, and he said these were raised up off the surface, and they looked more like some type of symbols in writing. And anyhow, his description, because he was a machinist most of his life, he said, it looked like somebody took liquid metal and poured into an acorn-shaped mold. There's no weld marks, no seams, no rip marks, no compartments, no external apparatus, no antenna, nothing like that. It's one solid piece of metal. And so people saw that. And Bill Bulleybush, I think I mentioned his name earlier, he was near Mammoth, and he went out and he saw the object kind of hesitate, make a turn, begin to track back towards roughly the Kecksburg area. So he jumps into his vehicle and goes to the highest point. So that was called Coons Lane back at the time. It was now nicknamed Meteor Road because of the event. And that was that long, narrow, winding road that parallels along that large wooded area where the object had fallen that evening. And he knew the area well because he hunted down there. And it's almost dark. And he sees like blue arc, and he said like kids playing with sparklers down in the woods. So he grabs his flashlight and he goes down through the fields over to the other side of the woods, and he sees this object down there. So different people saw this type of thing in the woods. And again, what's so interesting, and again, we're just doing briefly different parts of the story. There are so many people involved, so many major interviews and testimonies from very credible people who went into great detail. And many people's lives were affected by what happened that night. And so many people over the years were hoping that the government would someday come forward, because a lot of these people face a lot of ridicule.
Well, let me ask you a question. How soon did the authorities arrive?
Well, that's kind of interesting. You know, over the years, different people told me that they believed that within a relatively short time, within an hour, they began to see at least a small amount of military vehicles, like maybe a military jeep, riding around the area. But it was over a period of several hours during the evening that a lot of the military began to show up. They came in from different directions, and lots of people saw them. And
have you identified any of these military people?
I have identified one, and I can't say who it was. I'm not using names, but I've interviewed many sources, and I did interview one in particular who was a part of the security team that guarded the object when it came in during the early morning of December 10th, 1965, on a military flatbed tractor trailer that many people saw at Kecksburg. As the object was leaving, it went out around 1 o'clock in the morning. It was observed leaving the area. It was tarped over top of the object, and it got there during the early morning hours of December 10th. And this fellow went into great detail. Another independent military source confirmed his story as well, and others confirmed the fact that it went to Lockbourne. It stayed there for a short time under heavy security, then continued on to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And interestingly, in 1990, a reporter for the Greensburg Tribune Review, which is a large newspaper, had the opportunity to interview that man. He did not want to use his name or go public, but this person, the reporter, had the option to interview him, to look at his information he was able to show, and it made the front page. It was a front page story in 1990 in Tribune Review.
How did you find this guy?
I can't remember if it was something that over a period of time, and he came to me confidentially, which I think he did. You know, I interviewed hundreds of people. I've lost track how many hundreds of people I tracked down and interviewed over the years. You know, right after this happened, I'm 16 years old when this happened, and there was very few names in the paper, and I'm starting with the next day or two to try to get information, but there was not a lot. But I did begin to get some reports from people that knew about some of the incidents that happened out there at the time. But over a period of weeks and months and years, I began to, on occasion, hear from a witness. I would get people, neighbors, friends, relatives of people were involved. I would get anonymous tips. And by the 1980s, I had a lot of new information that suggested something did indeed fall near Kecksburg in 1965. So I really began to intensify the investigation. And I know Robert had brought up a lot of different things, and I know he had brought up about one of the witnesses, and he would have been Jim Romansky. And so Robert brought up the fact that there were some UFO researchers that had a UFO display at a mall in Greensburg in the 1980s. Well, that was my group. We are holding a very large public display of UFO information for the public in August of 1987 at the Westmoreland Mall. And Robert went on to say that there was a picture, a drawing of the Soviet Cosmos 96 that we've talked about, and that Jim happened to walk by and he said, "I saw it." Well, that's not exactly what happened, and that kind of, I scratched in my head because I'm trying to remember that when we had that display at the mall, we had a very small amount of information on Kecksburg at the time. And most of that information was some newspaper stories.
Well,
I had everything meant on a heavy card.
Stan, let me go back here because we moved away from where I wanted to go, and I wanted to stay kind of there in the woods for the moment. Because I don't understand how they got the object. If the object is down in the woods and they've moved it out on a flatbed truck, how did they do that?
Okay. Well, again, there's so much and so many details and so many things that happened during the evening. First you had some of the local residents go down and see the object, but they didn't call and report finding it at the time. They kept their mouth shut. Then you had later some of the volunteer firemen coming in because they're getting reports of this fiery object, and some people thought it was an aircraft that may have fell in the area. So the firemen are organizing a search in that large wooded area to go look for this downed aircraft. And then you had the military come in. So there were different things going on during the evening as things are going on. So the locals already find it, but the firemen don't know it's already been found. And then the military comes in. And I was down in the area many times and talked to many people who were involved in this. And what happened was you could not take the trucks right down into the woods where the object fell. And what they did, and again, very few people knew about this, some people had seen among the equipment that was there on the scene that night, they had a small crane. And one of the things that I also found out for years I didn't talk about till I had enough independent information, there was not just one, there were two military flatbed tractor trailers at the scene. And they had to winch it over and then load it on the flatbed truck. And John Hayes, who's gone public, I interviewed his mother years ago. That was the family that Robert indicated he didn't know anything about. I think you asked him a question about a family where the military was coming into their home. That was the Hayes family. They were renting a small farmhouse closer to the impact site. And they had a bunch of young children. And they had windows all around the house. So young John is 10 years old, I believe, at the time. And the kids are all excited because they're seeing on the farm road, that farm lane coming in, which they call their driveway, they see fire trucks, they see military vehicles, they see soldiers out there. And that evening, they have men in normal clothing, and then they have military people in their home in small groups, kind of whispering and talking, and apparently using their phone but reversing the calls. And at one point, young John remembered seeing a large flatbed tractor trailer going down empty down into that ravine, and later coming out with a target object, he said, the distance away, but it looked to be about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. And there were so many different accounts of people down in the woods. There were many, many people that I interviewed, and let me read you from an account.
Before you do that, we're going to have to take a break in just a moment, but let me kind of rephrase my question here because they don't really understand this. You've got this thing down in the middle of the woods. It's blocked by trees and everything else. It's down in the middle, and they transport it somehow from the impact site to a flatbed truck to truck it out there to Lockbourne Air Force Base.
Yes, the flatbed truck is at the edge of the field, but they can't take the truck right down, so they have to winch it over to the truck, and then they loaded it with the little crane onto the flatbed truck.
Well, I have a couple of questions. First of all, you had newsmen in the area. Did any of this appear in the contemporary newspaper accounts?
No, they didn't, because, I talked to different reporters who were there, and Bob Gaddy, who was a reporter for the Tribune Review, he wanted to go down into the woods. He believed there was something down there. The authorities up on the hill wouldn't let him go down. And he said, I'm going down. They said, if you do, you'll be arrested. Another fellow, Bill Weaver, had his dad's car that night. He was down there over on the dirt lane, which is closer to where the object had fallen. That's where a lot of the military activity was taking place. So many of the people who were up on the other hill across the road couldn't see what was going on over at the farm lane.
Okay,
we'll get
back to that in just a moment. I've got to take a break. You are listening to A Different Perspective on the X-Zone Broadcast Network. I'm here with Stan Gordon. We're talking about Kecksburg, and we will be back right after this, so please stick around. am here with Stan Gordon. We're talking Kecksburg. When we went away, I was wondering exactly how the military got the object out of the woods. If there was any contemporary accounts about that in the newspapers. There's reporters on the scene. And even if they weren't allowed to go down into the woods, I would have suspected that they would have talked to the other people standing around out there on the road, watching the events take place, so that they may have had some of that information. And what about this John Murphy guy who did a special report on this, I think, in the weeks that followed, talking to some of those people? Do we have any real contemporary accounts of that truck moving out of the area?
We do not. But we have multitudes of accounts from so many different people. And, it was in the mid-1980s, as we're getting some more information, we still did not have a witness at that point about seeing an object on the ground, only from other reports were coming in. And we got more and more information, and my team was searching down through that particular area, and we found what appeared to be a pattern, a trajectory, where the tops of trees were broken off, trees were knocked down in the same direction. And, we started to talk earlier about Jim Romansky. Jim Romansky, again, was, we first met when he came across our display at the mall with his family, and one of my associates, another person, was there with our small display in Kecksburg, and he stood there for a few minutes, and he listened in, and he said, "Are you talking about that thing that happened out in Kecksburg years ago?" And they said, "Yes." And he said, "I was a member of the search team that found the object." He was not from Kecksburg. He hadn't been out there since 1965. And later on, he offered to go with us out to that area. We told him absolutely nothing. We told him nothing about the tree damage or the area, and he remembered certain landmarks on that night. And he walked around for quite a long period of time. And as he walked around, he said, "You know what, fellas, I think we're right on the spot." And one of my associates and I looked at each other. That was right in the vicinity where we fell from the tree damage that the thing would have fallen. So interestingly, about 6 months later, young John Hayes, who was a little boy that was in that farmhouse near the impact site, they played in the woods every day. That was their playground. The next morning, after seeing all the military activity down in that area, was all lit up, and the military people around their home, they got up early the next morning. Well, they found out that they had some cows there. There was a fence. The military had cut their fence to take the vehicles down, so they had to repair that. So they're down in the woods, and he told me, he said, "We were down here the day before. The trees and everything were fine, so the next day the trees were knocked down and broken down." While they're down there the next day, they run into a man with some type of equipment. They weren't sure it was a Geiger counter or a metal detector, and the man told them, "You should get out of here. There's a chance of radiation." And the boys didn't know what radiation meant, so they went home. And again, that's another really important part of the story. There's so much here, Kevin. It would take us hours and hours to even get into it.
But what you're kind of jumping around in the time frame. It sounded like they were down in the woods the next day after Romansky told you about his story down there. And what you're saying is they were in the woods the next day after the object was removed. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So Romansky is not part of the story of the boys going into the woods finding the cut fence.
No, that's a separate thing. I am moving around. So Romansky takes us down to this spot where this happened. 6 months later, young John Hayes, who was down there the next day and saw the activity the night before, he took me to the same exact spot down into the woods, knew nothing about Romansky. This is a very thickly wooded area. This fell down in the ravine. You couldn't possibly see where this thing fell unless you were standing there from any of the surrounding roads or hills. And then a year later, we get an anonymous tip that this fellow named Bill Bullybush had gotten down into the woods right after it fell. So I contacted him.
Wait. A year later, this is after Romansky talked to you guys in the mall, but not a year later after the event in Kecksburg, after the thing fell.
In 1987, Romansky takes us down. Then 6 months later, John Hayes takes me to the same site. And then in 1988, we meet Bill Bullybush. He takes us down from a completely different vantage point of this large wooded area We go the whole way down to the other side of the woods. We come to a particular tree, and he said, I stood at this tree, and he points and said, that's where the object was. It was the exact place that they had taken us to, and they had no way of knowing about the other people, and there's no way they could have known unless they were there.
But from your descriptions, you tell me two things. One, this is a heavily wooded area. This object fell in the middle of this, I'm saying middle of this wooded area, and yet the military was able to move this thing out of that area, from what you say, with relative ease.
Well, it took a while, and again, it wasn't that far from the edge of the woods in that particular place when they found it, but they couldn't take the trucks in because of the trees and things like that. They couldn't take the truck right down to the site, so they had to winch it. They had to do some work, and they had to winch it over, and then they used that small crane, apparently, to put it on top of the truck.
Yeah, you said that there were a lot of people that showed up on the road after the thing fell.
There were two roads. There was the road that is the road that parallels along the woods, where probably hundreds of people were on a little two-lane road that night, but the object fell way on the other side of the woods, where you wouldn't have been able to see it in the dark from that distance, and it was by that side of the woods, which was an old dirt farm lane, where a lot of the military activity was taking place, and where they apparently the truck came out, and was seen by different people. Jerry Betters is another fellow that went public, among many others. Jerry Betters was a well-known jazz musician in the Pittsburgh area. He was renting a farm out around Murraysville, so it's between Pittsburgh and Greensburg, and something had frightened his horses that afternoon, and then he heard on the radio about the object fell near Kecksburg. So he got some of his friends, and they drove him out to the scene, and these people all were able to describe certain landmarks, certain details. It was on that dirt lane that other people describe. He sees a fire truck, he sees military vehicles, and they look down to the left, down towards the woods in the field where this all was taking place, where many people describe, and he sees this military flatbed tractor trailer with a big star on it, and here's the object on the trailer, but for whatever reason at that point, some of the tarp was open or came apart or whatever, and he gets a look at this thing, and it's in the distance, but he can see it fairly clearly. And about that time, an Army officer comes out, starts yelling at these young soldiers, "Get them out of here! Get them out of here!" They all aim their rifles at them, and the fellow who was driving the car was scared, and they left.
Okay, I have two questions for you. First of all, you're gathering all this information later. You weren't there on scene that night, is that correct?
I was not on the scene that night. I wasn't even driving yet.
I just wanted to make sure we had that clear. So you're gathering the information later. I have no problem with that, because I gathered an awful lot of Roswell information long after the event took place.
And what's really interesting, going back to that KDK radio show where they're talking about this breaking news story, during the evening, Bill Burns, who was a well-known news anchor in Pittsburgh, was breaking in on regular TV broadcasting live that evening with reports that the military had arrived in the Kecksburg area to search for an unidentified flying object. And that went on a couple of times. I mean, that was a major news story. And you had all these reporters on the scene that I interviewed who either interacted with the military or saw the military. And there were so many. Here's in front of me is a statement. And this is from a fellow that is a well-known person in the area. He actually owns... he's a funeral director, and he went on to great detail, and I believe he did go public, and that talked about how he and his friends, after hearing about the incident, found their way out to Kecksburg, and they go into great detail about the terrain and the fences they have to crawl over and everything. And Dave Newhouse, his name, he talks about what happened that night, and I'm not going to read all this to you, but this one part's interesting. They're going over the fence, and he said, I don't remember if there was a fence on top of that, but we could see spotlights just over the knob and to the right. We started walking very quietly towards the light when a soldier appeared in front of us with a rifle. He yelled, "Halt," and scared the S out of me at the same time. I thought he was going to shoot us. From that point, I could see a big truck, a Jeep, and a fire truck, and something covered by a tent or canvas. There were people all over the place. I have no idea what was taking place, or all the security and the military may be very suspicious. I remember sort of walking very fast back to the Nash, the car, and slipping in a cow pie going down the hill.
So he's talking about an armed soldier in this area at that time. Are there any contemporary reports of the soldiers being armed? If their soldiers were there, were they armed?
No, they didn't. They did mention Army and Air Force, and they did, of course, mention state police, and they didn't say, well, the state police are armed. No, they did not. They didn't go into great detail, just the fact that there's Army and Air Force personnel involved in it, and there were many local and national news stories that talked about that.
But we don't have any contemporary reports of armed military personnel there. I know there were at least 3 guys there from the Air Force because they came out from Pittsburgh, from a radar station there.
There was a 662nd Radar Squadron. There were 3 Air Force people involved, and actually they found another person that they was tracked down. I interviewed some people from that unit, and that was a part of the Oakdale, the Army support facility at Oakdale. And, again, the government did a really good job of covering their tracks, their paper trail, because there were so many witnesses that observed the military, observed the Army. Just to give you an idea again, here's a statement from another fellow I interviewed. He had got out in the military 3 years before. He had a very important position in the military. He knew the military quite well and equipment. He was on the scene as things were just developing that evening, and he goes into, he said he was familiar with military vehicles. He stated that a large amount of equipment was coming into the site from the road and somewhere down in the field that would lead down to the woods of the crash site. He clearly remembers 2 large military flatbed trucks, both with large searchlights. He also said there were several military cars, jeeps, and trucks, and the witness stated from where he stood looking down the hollow, they could plainly see bright blue arcing like water sparks.
But the point really is, you've got reporters in the area, you've got people running around loose. Are there any newspaper stories from that time, from December 10th, 11th, 12th of 1965, reporting on these activities? You see what I'm getting at?
Let me tell you this. Again, this is a detail that many people do not know. This is December 9, 1965. We know from many people, including, again, independent military sources, the object was transported to Lockbourne Air Force Base near Columbus, Ohio, early the next morning, then continued on to Wright-Patterson. And the next day, in the paper, the official explanation is from the officials that nothing had fallen, it was a bright meteor in the sky. But for years, and this is one of the details that I would not publicly talk about until I had enough independent confirmation, for years I had reports that people in the area the next day saw other, not as many like the night before, but they saw men in what they called moon suits or decontamination outfits carrying equipment down. They saw other investigators and people down in the woods. And interestingly, so here's the Pittsburgh Press, one of the major newspapers in the country, December 10th, and I'm not going to read the whole story, but it says, as Friday's paper, it says, meanwhile, scientists and Army and Air Force officials resumed the search today for a smoldering object reported to have fallen in a wooded area, Kecksburg, Westmoreland County. And then even more interesting, because it took me years and years to find this local news story, because nobody could find it or obtain it through microfilm at the time. It was the local weekly paper closer to Kecksburg. Kecksburg was in Mount Pleasant Township. So this was the Mount Pleasant Journal. And it says, many questions still unanswered. Mystery surrounds area's fallen object. And again, it's a big story. I'm not going to read it all, but just a couple details that the immediate area would...
Stan, you're going to have to read it after my break.
That's fine. Thank you.
You're going to have to hang on there. We've got to take a quick break. We're talking with Stan Gordon. We're talking about Kecksburg in 1965 and the possibility of something falling in the woods near that little town. You are listening to A Different Perspective on the X Zone Broadcast Network. Please stick around. Stan Gordon is my guest. We are talking about Kecksburg. I interrupted him when he was about to provide us with a contemporary newspaper account from a small newspaper that he managed to track down. And you were going to say about that, Stan?
Just, again, somebody excerpts from it. It says, the immediate area where the unidentified object was reported to have fallen was roped off on the possibility that if something had fallen, it may have contained radioactive material. But then it also goes on to say that, now we're talking about Friday morning, at dawn, searchers resumed their work. By Friday evening, the area had been thoroughly scoured by police, military authorities, scientists with Geiger counters, and other volunteers.
Okay, but the thing that's tripping me up here is we have no names of soldiers. We have reports of armed men, armed soldiers. I'm saying soldiers as opposed to police officers because I assume the police officers would be armed. It bothers me that they would have been, the military would have been out there with weapons. This doesn't seem right to me.
And it bothered a lot of the civilians who were out there too. And there were many of them who talked about this. One young fellow, and again, a lot of this has gone public, and in many cases, people did not want to talk about it publicly for various reasons, their positions. The military sources, I have their names. I know who they are. And, you know, I hope you understand that I always have to respect confidentiality, which I've done in thousands of cases, and that's why I can't release it. But I can assure you that I know who these people are. And the reporter for the Tribune Review knows the identity of that military source who was a part of the security team at Lockbourne Air Force Base. And I can tell you, for example, and again, there's so many different details. Bob Kowaleski was a retired state police trooper in eastern Pennsylvania at the time it happened, but he was from Greensburg. He happened to come home about 2 weeks after the incident, and he ran into Carl Metz, the state police fire marshal, who was down at the scene. And actually, later in conversation, he actually mentioned to some other police officers that he was there that day in Kecksburg years later, and he saw the object, but he was sworn to secrecy by an Army officer not to talk about some details. And Bob Kowaleski, the trooper, when he met Carl Metz, Carl told him, I was sworn to secrecy by an Army officer, and I can't talk to you about what happened.
What was hanging me up is the idea that these guys were armed.
Yeah.
And you understand the concept of posse comitatus, which means that active duty forces are not allowed to perform police functions.
Well, I can only tell you what many people have told me. Some went public. I have statements from them. I just read you one about, I told you about Jerry Betters, where soldiers, he said, aimed weapons at the rifles at them. I gave you also another statement from another very credible source, the funeral director, who told me that a soldier aimed a rifle at him and he thought he was going to get shot. There were other people in the town who saw soldiers walking around with helmets, had sidearms and rifles. And there were many of them. But people, you know, it's 1965. The next day when it's in the paper, the government's saying there was nothing there, nothing was going on, they found nothing. People kept their mouths shut. It was a whole different time period. And that's how it was. And again, there are many people over the years, I've talked to family members and others who I know were involved in, and they still years later, we're going on 56 years next month, and they still won't talk about it, and many have gone to their graves not knowing the truth about what happened. But so many people knew that that's what occurred that night, and what the object was, we don't know. And by the way, Kevin, you know, if you'd read over what I've talked about and discussed for years and years, I've never tried to prove that the object that fell was an extraterrestrial spacecraft from another planet. I've always said that that's a possibility that we need to at least consider. But, you know, I always said that this could have been a highly advanced man-made space probe with some type of reentry control capability, a secret government or military experiment, but possibly, could it be a spacecraft from another planet? Well, we don't know. And there's so much information we didn't have time to even begin to discuss. But there was no doubt the object made turns within miles before it fell. Witnesses who saw it come over very low said it was moving no faster than the speed of a small aircraft on approach to an airport. Some heard a hissing sound. And it's just an amazing case, regardless of what the object was. There's no doubt in my mind, and those people who were involved, that an object did fall and was recovered by the military. And what that object was, well, hopefully someday we might know for sure the truth.
But what do you say to people like Bob Young, who talk about the smoke train from a meteor being persistent for 30 minutes, and that meteoric debris was found, I think, in Quebec, Canada, that seemed to be related to this?
Well, again, that's one area of the case that's really intriguing because we don't have a detailed explanation for. But I can tell you, that meteor report that occurred at 4:43 p.m. over Michigan, it must have been a very slow meteor, because the object seen over Pittsburgh was at 4:47 p.m. as confirmed by the control tower at the Greater Pittsburgh Airport. So, was it the same object? Could there have been two separate objects in the sky at the same time? What the object that looked like a meteor in Michigan, maybe something else. You remember Project Twinkle when they investigated the green fireball reports, and how many reports we've had over the years of meteor-like objects that perform and do things that normal meteors shouldn't do. So we may never know a part of that. But whatever the object was that came over the Greater Pittsburgh area at 4:47 p.m. is the object that fell near Kecksburg.
And the information you gathered all of it, most of it years later, not at the time of the event, and the newspaper accounts seem to suggest it was something mundane. They don't talk about the armed military personnel. They don't talk about the things that took place afterwards. And you've said there were a lot of reporters on the scene. That kind of boggles my mind that even being at 1965, that the reporters who'd seen something would have reported, this is what I saw while I was there.
Well, you've got to remember, you've got to see the way the geography of the land is. There's curves and hills everywhere. The majority of reporters were up on the hill along the curve of Meteor Road. Most of the military activity and the activity dealing with the recovery was way on the opposite side of the woods where they couldn't see it. So there was a lot of things going on, and there were people spread out all over the place. And again, the witnesses I talked to, they never reported it at the time. They kept their mouths shut because they saw the news the next day that nothing had fallen. It was a meteor in the sky. They knew it wasn't what it was. They shared their stories that I talked to some of those people, and they told some of those people about it, and years later, some of those people confirmed that those witnesses had told them about it at the time. I was hearing some reports within days of the incident from some people about things that happened out there at that time. But the people didn't want to go public. And there was not a lot of detail in the papers.
Stan, I don't have trouble with the people not talking about it. I get that. I understand. We can look at any number of UFO cases where we found witnesses later and they said, well, I didn't come forward because. I got that. What I'm concerned about are the reporters who were there, and their job was to report that. And if they had seen the military, if they'd seen something like that, I don't understand why that wouldn't have been reported in the newspapers.
Okay, well, I can tell you one other thing. John Murphy, the news director at WHJB, and this was confirmed to me by other people at the station, John had gotten the call about the object falling around Kecksburg. He proceeded out to the scene. He got there about an hour earlier before the state police fire marshal and another investigator went down into the site. And interestingly, he was there when that happened. And he approached the state police fire marshal and asked him what he had found when he was down in the woods that day. And initially he said, or not really sure. And then when he pressed him again, he said, you better get your information from the Army. But what I started to tell you was John got there before they arrived. He was in radio communication with his wife and with people at the radio station. According to what these people told me was, he told them he found the object down in the woods. He said there was strange markings on it. He took pictures of it. And I talked to Mabel Mazza, who passed away about 2 years ago. She was the office manager at WHJB. She told me she saw his black and white picture. She said what she could remember was kind of a cone-shaped object lying down under the trees. And he never went public with that for whatever reason. And there's a lot of little anecdotes like this. There's so many of them we even got into. There's so much I've probably forgotten. I can't even remember now. But there were so many details from people who don't know each other. Many of them never knew each other, even today. And they gave me the little details. They were able to give me landmarks to indicate they were there. Other people's details were confirming other people's accounts. There were so many people involved, and when you put the piece of the puzzle together, it's just an amazing account.
Didn't John Murphy do a radio show called The Object in the Woods?
That is correct, and he did not mention anything about it. And that was an interesting story because of what had happened prior to him airing that show. And the people at the station all gave me separate confirmation. The people who worked at the station who were there that day, that apparently these government men came into the station, and they wanted to talk to John Murphy. He went into one of the studios, and when he came out, they said he was very, very shook up and upset, and said they had confiscated a lot of the voice interviews that he had done for the radio show coming up. And in the days and weeks to follow, this was his biggest story. He was all excited about it, and suddenly he didn't want to talk about it anymore.
But he did air the program, The Object in the Woods, so it was a sanitized version.
That is right. It was a sanitized, censored version. There was a lot of beeping along the line of the interview. Okay.
I fear we've just run out of time here. I appreciate you taking time to talk with me. Your website is www.stangordon.info.
You're right, that's right. StanGordon.info.
And Stan Gordon is one word, all lowercase. And you can take a look at his website. You can gather some more information there. I'll have something up on the on my blog about this as well, so that and maybe some links to some of the other stories. Stan, thank you so much for taking time to chat with us, and we maybe have to do this again sometime soon to get, I guess, the rest of the story.
All right, Kevin, thanks very much for having me on the program.
Okay, thank you, Stan. In the coming weeks, there's a book out called When Einstein Went to Roswell by a Dr. Peter Strasberg. And if I had to look back to see the title of the book, I'm going to have him on the program next week. We're going to talk about the information that he presents in this book and how he's linked Einstein to the Roswell case. The reason I hesitated there was going to say how he linked Einstein to the Roswell case. I'm not sure the link is really very solid. And we'll get his take on that and how he came to write this book and what the evidence is that Einstein was involved in the recovery, or at least examination of the object that fell in New Mexico back in 1947, where we find some of the same things going on there that Stan talked about, some of the military operations there and the way they kind of suppressed information, which is, I guess we can kind of agree that does go on periodically, but it's usually under the cloak of national security. And like I said, I've talked about that in UFOs in the Deep State as well, and how that works, and that they may wrap that mantle of national security on things that really don't deserve it, and that sort of thing. I also wanted to mention that I've got a book, the Best of Project Blue book, which I think will help understand part of this as well. When I've looked at in-depth Blue Book investigations, and I could apply information gathered long after Blue Book closed or the investigation ended, and apply that to the information that was published at the time, and see where the mistakes were made. And I think that anybody who's looked at Project Blue Book understands mistakes were made about how they operated and what they were doing at the time. But I think that gives you an idea of the haphazard nature of the investigation. Sometimes they were very good. Sometimes they did a great deal of important work, and sometimes they just sort of didn't do much of anything else. So I'll have that coming up in the next few weeks on a different perspective. I should point out that there are some other fine programs on the X-Zone Broadcast Network. So if you have a chance, go to xzbn.net and scroll down the list of programs, and you'll find something that's going to be very interesting, I'm sure. I will be back, as I say, in 164 hours, 165 hours, I've forgotten the number now, with Dr. Peter Strasberg talking about Roswell. Thanks for listening.